what does Little Nightmares 3 hide in the Carnival behind the scenes? Following the escape of the candy factory, we'll be making our way through a carnival as we encounter some new goons to deal with, alongside the kin. But how does this area of the game work off camera? What can we find out of bounds? And how does the game respond if we mess with it in unintended ways? Well, let's find out. So please enjoy this alternative look at Little Nightmares 3, The Carnival. Starting off, we find ourselves startled by a new character, as it appears that we have a guide now. The gnome will lead us on a chase throughout this next room, as we play hide and seek with it, essentially giving us a way out of this room in the end. Following the leader, we'll continue this chase, as the gnome leads us to this furnace. Turning on the heat will result in the gnome giving us a battery, which in turn allows us to use this elevator to progress. Let's take a closer look at how all this transpires though. So, at the beginning here, we can see how our gnome friend is sitting back here behind the mirror, prior to it running out. When it comes running out, we can see how once it reaches the other room, it'll disappear, as another model of the gnome awaits us, being the gnome that we normally see at this part. Zooming out, we can also see that it's presently just these two rooms that are loaded in at the moment. This will be a reoccurring theme with the gnome vanishing, as we can see it disappearing right as it makes it behind this box. This particular drawer will start shaking, suggesting that the gnome is moving about in it. But upon bringing the camera in here, we can see that there is in fact no gnome. At least not yet. It's only until the player pulls this open that we'll see the gnome is loaded in, as it's jumping out. Trying to get a better view of the gnome spawning in, I deleted the drawer here, but it ended up being my demise, since I was no longer able to progress with this sequence. Once resolving that, in a similar fashion, the gnome will run into this chair and disappear here, as we can see another model of it standing behind the chair, which is for when we jump on the cushion, to get it to come back out. We'll also see how the chair cushion moves about on its own, which makes sense. Why attempt to add an actual model of the gnome doing this when the player would never see it? Oh, and deleting the chair, yes, it also locks us from progressing. Making its journey up into the cabinets, we'll see our gnome friend disappear again, where we can see the boxes up on these shelves moving about on their own. There is no sight of the gnome during this part, but this will change once shooting the bottle that's up here, as the gnome will spawn behind it during the bottle's destruction. It'll then begin a strange journey back here as it clips throughout the walls, eventually disappearing and reappearing once again, making its way out and onto the ladder. Once reaching the top of this ladder, it unloads from this section. However, panning the camera over this way during this point, we can see the gnome is already in this hall awaiting us. It's fair to say that we've encountered many more gnomes than what we're led to believe. Back in this room, I decided to teleport up here to see how Alone, my bot partner, would react with the ledge being too long of a jump. However, Alone said, "Hold my juice box," as she proceeded to clear this jump with ease, making for an impressive long jump. Not much is occurring out of bounds here, outside of another gnome that's sitting in the void, but I will say the backgrounds are filled with creepy stuff, as you can see. Coming into this room, where there's a collectible, you'll see that there's a pair of feet within this stall. Taking a look back here shows a funny sight, as we find that it's just a pair of long legs on top of the toilet. Progressing down the hall, we'll see the gnome doing another disappearing act, with another already at the button for the furnace. This gnome will also disappear and reappear while rewarding us for turning on the heat though. How many gnomes is that now? I've lost count. However, after a warm and cozy break with this fella, we'll go ahead and continue on as we normally would. Using the battery we were just given allows us to get a flashlight, which leads to some exploring, as we eventually find a way to power up this contraption that's in the bigger room. Placing it accordingly allows us to proceed. Pushing on, we'll make our way up this tall room, which leads to, once again, a bit more exploring, as we eventually encounter our first live interaction with the puppet. Acquiring the key from within its head allows us to proceed, as we explore this outside area, followed with this oven puzzle. We'll then climb up this very unsafe situation, as it eventually gives, making for a quick escape. Pulling this lever reveals that we're not alone though, as we'll end up having to go this way, which leads to the key we need. You'll notice that there's more and more of these puppets lingering about at this point, like the place is crawling with them. This follows with a trap they set, as we have to fight them off in this locked room. Let's rewind back though, and take a closer look at what we just went through. Taking this elevator up, we'll see how this bigger room is loaded in at this point. It's pretty dark, but luckily this is where we end up getting the flashlight. we can see how this background is a fairly deep room with no visible floor. That being said, it's unfortunately not explorable for our little friends. Hey look, he's still floating out here. When turning on the power for this machine that rises from the floor, we can see how these two puppets will disappear, as we're led to believe they broke free while the player backtracks. We can see that they actually are just moved down from the map though. Make a pose. Following this gnome back shows that it'll run back behind this pole like so. We can of course see how the contraption will rise from beneath though, but at this point, I wanted to stress test Alone's hops again, to see if she can scale this machine with it being in the wrong position. She did not disappoint as she made it look easy. Just look at her go! Appreciating the trophies that are in the background led me to getting a closer look at this fella too. Glorious. There's also a hand here that I'd like to think is a call out to the second game, as we did encounter them at one point. The bottles that fall in this tall room to suggest that someone is up above can be seen loading in within the room. Alone got stuck here for me, which was brief, but it was funny to see when it happened, and luckily it didn't break the game. Another notable piece in the background that I saw was this mannequin stand that appears to belong to the lady from the first game, which I thought was pretty cool. However, it isn't visible through normal gameplay, as it's too high to look up at. There's not much occurring as we approach this first puppet that we end up destroying, but there are some vile and terrifying things we come across during this part, if you look closely. Taking out the head of the puppet in slow motion shows how the physics get wonky when doing so, as the explosion is much more intense. At this point though, we can see how a portion of the outside is loaded in now, as more will come into view once we reach here, as you'll see while we zoom out. A lot of this area looks vacant, as there'll be more that loads in, so we'll come back to this later. Totally bypassing this carriage that will fall once pulling the boards off it, we now get our first look at the Kin. We can see how he'll turn the light on once noticing our presence. He'll then end up just frozen in this position though. Why so serious, Mr. Kin? We're nearing the trap that is set for us by the puppets though, as their presence becomes more known, as you can clearly see. We can view how this one functions in the background, as it'll appear when shutting us in, remaining in a frozen state. If I had to compare them to the porcelain children from the second game though, I'd say we got off easy, as these guys aren't incredibly hard to take care of, which is exactly what we do here. We've reached where we stopped though, so let's go ahead and continue on. Finishing off these puppets, we'll push on as we make our way deeper into this carnival, all while avoiding being seen by these big boys. There doesn't seem to be any supervision going on for these folks, who are doing whatever they please, as we can see throughout our exploration. There's a lot of sneaking around this area, along with a battery puzzle and a magic trick. There's a roller coaster we'll end up getting on as well, which entails quite an eye full of things, as we pass through multiple areas while on this ride. With the ride concluding, we'll eventually find ourselves officially meeting the Kin. A sequence of events will happen here, as we need to eventually acquire this lever, which allows us to proceed. This leads us into another chase that ends up taking place with the mini-Kin, aka the dummy. We'll stop here though and take a closer look at everything we just endured. So, once making it out into this area with all the big fellas, you'll see that there are only so many of these guys that are active models. They will continuously follow these set paths they are on, eventually warping, only to repeat the path they had just walked. The rest of the herd that we'll see in the background are sprites though, as you can see. So I of course delete this fence in an attempt to explore back here. But I noticed when doing this that Alone will stray away from us, eventually coming to a stop in this area. My guess is that the bot, being Alone, could not understand where we were as the player, seeing that we went out of bounds. While walking out here though, the herd couldn't care less that we're here. All the stands and tents out here don't have much to reveal when taking a closer look at them all, but nonetheless, it was neat to see. We can see more closely how our characters fall into this bucket though, as they'll actually clip through the ground during this process. However, there's a baddie here that we need to lure in with this cart of candy, which I ended up deleting to see if it made any kind of difference. Not so surprisingly, it resulted with nothing changing, outside of getting this view of the oh-so-hungry fella. Just like the Lost Boys and Hook, he's using his imagination. There are some puppets we can see in the background here, but these particular two ended up causing me to create more problems for myself. In a panic state, I tried deleting them when they were chasing me, which resulted in taking out some floorboards. This ultimately created a situation where Alone kept ending herself, as the bot simply followed its set paths, despite the lack of flooring. I did take a closer look at this pinata session, as they too will simply ignore me. But I digress. There's a gruesome part where we end up essentially drowning one of the herd here as we drop him into this bucket. Watching from another angle, we can see this big boy does disappear though once his body is fully in the bucket. Meanwhile, Alone is somehow not falling to her death here, which prompted me to restart the game, as it was soft-locked due to this. Following this is the part where we must sneak by a lot of these puppets. I wanted to see if I could fight them off with Alone though, but I quickly realized this wasn't possible, as they will overwhelmingly swarm us. However, removing these boards here while entering and exiting the area will freeze these bad boys in place. This allowed me to go to town, as I horror-scoped each and every one of these fools with my bow. Alone, of course, didn't contribute, but I was happy to see she didn't get herself nabbed during this, as we were able to push on. Not much occurs in this particular section, but we'll get a different view though, where we can see the herd enjoying themselves on a swing carousel. I tried warping over to them to join the fun, which resulted in death, but as you can see, they're having the time of their miserable lives. Pressing on, we can once again see how they utilize a fixed amount of herd here, with them pacing about in the background, along with this one, who is patiently waiting for us, as we need to avoid him when traveling down below. There's a gnome down here as well, but even with being able to reach it, you'll see we can't do much else with it. So with this roller coaster scene, my camera movement was sadly limited, as this was an issue I ran into every time a cutscene takes place. Before starting the ride though, we can see how it looks, as it's only the track that's fully loaded in at this point. I was able to manage to get this perspective though, as it allows us to see how the entirety of this ride looks from afar, loading and unloading the sections as the player rides through them. Continuing forward, I deleted the doors as I made my way to the kin. As we can see, they clearly lead nowhere, but it's now time to check out the kin. The purple-suited man can be found sleeping on a chair, along with his trusty dummy. The board hanging on the ground here alerts this guy, so I figured I'd just go ahead and delete boards and see what happens. Well, along with deleting this box, you can see that we're able to proceed as usual, with the door in the background opening, as the kin would normally be walking out of it at this point. We may have the kin fooled here, however, coming back and looking at them, we can see the dummy is furious, as he peers at us with his red eyes. Coming back over here, we can confirm that he is in fact staring at the player, as his gaze is locked onto us. As for the kin, he ain't waking up. So with that, I restarted the game. We can see how when this normally plays out, that the kin will get up, but eventually will unload, as he'll load back in behind these doors, where he'll wait for his cue to come in. The dummy is hilarious to observe here, as he demands his meal, but overall, the kin will cut up some meat from the body on the table, which I had removed at this point, as he'll then feed it to the dummy, following with a utensil exchange, as this sequence will repeat itself, which is all that really takes place here. This leads up to the chase we're about to have with the dummy though, so let's continue on from here. We now have the dummy hot on our trail, as we're able to elude him by entering this elevator. This turns out to be temporary safety though. We're met by the kin on the next floor, as the dummy makes his way up here too. Following this, we'll see that Lo and Alone have been obviously caught, but Alone's crate could not hold her, as you can see. We'll have to make a distraction at this point that ultimately leads to our escape from this situation. The gnome's freedom ends up making for a perfect distraction. Proceeding forward, we'll end up coming into contact with another prisoner who appears to be wearing a dunce hat. We'll move their crate, which leads to our escape. While traversing down under, we'll see the gnome who helped distract the kin for us take his last breath as the kin catches him. We'll then end up sneaking about this area, eventually finding a way for Alone to join us as we lower this light down for her. Following this, we'll find the kin out here as he's making this dunce juggle for him on stage. More sneaking around will lead us up and above this auditorium, where we'll need to lower down and quietly obtain this key that's sitting here. A key for a door that appears to have an alarm system hooked up to it. This will initiate a chase for the kin, which has a brief intermission, but ultimately turns into our final rundown with this creep. Prevailing over the couple obstacles in between, we'll find ourselves getting into a hot air balloon, as the kin blindly attempts to shoot us with a double-barrel shotgun, all while the dummy climbs up the side of our ride. Giving one more tug to the torch here eliminates the dummy in a blaze of glory as we float away into the storm, eventually being struck down by lightning. We'll then wake up in this padded room at this point, where we eventually snap right back to the crash site of our balloon, concluding the chapter. Let's once again head back though, and take one last closer look at this carnival. So when beginning the chase with the dummy, we can see how he'll appear behind this wall with the vent cover. Outside of that, there isn't much to see. However, I of course made my situation more difficult than it had to be when I decided to delete this board here in an attempt to make the dummy fall to his death. He still manages to cross it though, making me the dummy, as I thought the coast was clear. That's until he showed up and alone decided to shut the elevator on me. When I went to do this again, the board was still deleted, which ended with both Low and Alone's demise. Unglorious. Before starting this chase sequence though, we can see over here how the kin and his dummy are already loaded in for the elevator part, as they float out here in a T-pose. They are the epitome of "look at my son, isn't he so handsome?" However, when reaching the elevator safely, we can zoom out and watch how the whole sequence looks while going up into this elevator. The kin will assume his position, while the dummy down below is still heading towards the vent, all while this other dummy up above makes his way down and towards the kin. I imagine Low and Alone needs some new britches at this point, but I digress. The area will unload, like so, as we enter this next scene. It'll just be these two rooms that are loaded presently, as we can see the kin filling out some important documents. Maybe it's a screenplay they're writing for the poor dunce kid? Getting their attention will endure what I can only imagine being the most foul breath imaginable. This ends with a gnome fleeing, as we can see it within the wall here when leaving the room, and it eventually disappears. The same can be said for the kin, as he too eventually unloads. We can take a quick tour around the level at this moment though, as you'll see how everything is presently loaded in. When entering the kitchen area, there's a person you can find here that's hanging out of a cage. It was intriguing to me, seeing as they are roughly the same size as our characters, and it makes one wonder, whose deceased body is this? Was it another traveler like ourselves? Nonetheless, it was interesting to look at closely. Speaking of prisoners though, this is where we encounter the dunce kid. Observing them, we can see they have green hair along with rugged green clothing. This kid almost seems like they belong in Kakiri Forest from Zelda, based on their appearance. You can also see how they have quite a few scars, which begs the question, what has this poor soul been through? They'll just stand within this cage indefinitely. Even if we free them from this cage, you'll see that they don't flinch one bit. We wish you the best of luck, friend. This whole sequence where the kin chases the gnome and kills it sucks, but we can see how they assume their positions right as the scene begins. The only thing I can say about this sad loss we have to witness is not all heroes wear capes. Thank you for helping us escape, brave soldier. This monster will eventually vanish after committing this horrendous crime. Once we're up and above though, we can see that the kin is carrying our Kokiri friend. He'll walk about with them, eventually leaving the area where we'll see the kin unload, leaving the forest kid floating about as we'll clip through the door here and disappear. We've reached the auditorium though, as we can see not much has changed out of bounds. Looking like a horror edition of America's Got Talent, we can see how this poor kid struggles to please the kin. I could only imagine the pressure he's under, not to mention the dead audience in the background too. I thought I'd mess with the kin here, and decide to alert him while warping back up to safety to see how he'd react. The forest kid can be found back here, where he ran to this position as he froze in place, while the kin simply runs in place towards our duo. Which makes sense. Granted, it's normally a 100% fail here if he's alerted. When we open the door with the alarm though, we'll see that he'll unload and appear right at the door, where he'll then begin his chase with us. The whole chase scene is only partially loaded in at this point, as it's mostly the interactive stuff that's loaded in here. I also noticed that there's another model of the dummy that can be found up here. I was trying to understand why he's up here, and could only guess that it may be the model of the dummy that we end up seeing when it pursues us through this vent here. Mere speculation though, as it all happens fairly fast. The kin will unsurprisingly load in here, as we end up getting pursued by him once again. And I don't know why, but I was trying to warp myself during this part to potentially sequence break the chase, but it just simply wouldn't let me. Getting to the hot air balloon though, we can take a look at how the kin arms himself. It's not a formal approach, but he'll contort his legs in an unnatural way, as he bends over, clipping into the shelf, as the shotgun eventually just ends up in his hands. It's fair to say that we should have no fears of actually being hit by this blind fool. Here comes this dummy though. We currently can't see the fire when hitting him with it, as it's disabled, but I'm glad we had this particular view, as it allows us to see every bit of pain in his face as he burns. When he goes tumbling off our ride, it's pretty funny. he'll gloriously fall to his death as his model freezes midair, where he'll remain indefinitely. The view we get here varies based on the display we use. As you can see though, the outside area for this hot air balloon ride is quite large. There's really nothing else we can do here though, seeing as we're in a cutscene. Watching the balloon fall as it gets struck by lightning follows with this unavoidable black screen, which transitions us into the next area. It's here where we'll see that we're back in the padded room, as the hypnotist, named Otto, watches from afar. We can also find models of Lone Alone out here where Otto is. This padded room we're in is located underneath the shores we end up crashing on, where we'd normally begin the next chapter. Otto will do a creepy slide like he did in the previous encounter. We can see 2 Alone dolls outside the room as well. But with that, that's everything I discovered within the Carnival in Little Nightmares 3. I hope you enjoyed this game-breaking adventure. Subscribe right now to see the rest of the game, and I'll see you all soon. Cheers!